Okay, well, this is the final lecture of the course, and I'm hoping that some of the threads that have been running through the course are going to come together in a satisfying way, because this is their last chance to do that. Now, at the beginning of the course, I said that we were going to look at what I called the naturalistic part of Buddhism. We weren't going to talk about reincarnation or deities. We were going to talk about Buddhist ideas about the mind and about reality, and we were going to try to assess some of those ideas from a scientific point of view. And I hope it's clear that we've done some of that. So, for example, this Buddhist emphasis on impermanence, the idea that kind of everything is impermanent, especially pleasure, and that our failure to reckon with that and see it clearly causes suffering and a certain kind of undercurrent of unsatisfactoriness in life. And we saw that there's a pretty plausible account from evolutionary psychology of why pleasure might be designed by natural selection to be very impermanent, fleeting, to evaporate quickly, and why that by design might leave us unsatisfied, and why our minds might be designed to kind of not get the picture, to really not see that clearly. We also looked at the not-self doctrine, the idea that in some sense the self as we normally think of it doesn't exist. And we saw that indeed modern psychology provides reason to doubt that at least a conscious kind of CEO in control self really exists. There's reason to wonder whether the self that we kind of naturally think of existing does in fact exist. And we also saw that a particular modern kind of theory of the mind, the modular model of the mind, actually helps explain some of the texture of meditative experience, and also suggests that certain meditative experiences, in particular those associated with kind of seeing not self, may indeed be kind of an accurate view of the workings of a modular mind. Okay, so in various ways, we've kind of given some corroboration, some validation to the Buddhist view of things. In this lecture, I want to consolidate that and extend it. And the way I'd like to frame what we're up to here is that I want to take a question that's been kind of hovering over the course and put it in particularly dramatic form. I want to ask the question, is enlightenment really enlightenment? Okay, so I'm referring, of course, to this idea that at the culmination of the Buddhist path, there is this state, this experience known as enlightenment, even if it's rarely attained, and it involves a kind of perfectly clear vision of things, and also, nicely, is accompanied by liberation from suffering. So, the question I want to ask is, does enlightenment really deserve its name? Now, this may strike you as kind of a moot question, a question that doesn't have a lot of practical significance, because after all, how many of us are realistically, hoping to attain actual enlightenment in the course of our lifetimes? And it's true that I don't think a lot of us probably will, and speaking for myself, certainly. On the other hand, if you are seriously pursuing the meditative path in a Buddhist context, then in theory you are trying to get closer, at least, to this thing out there known as enlightenment. And if indeed this however hard to attain thing known as enlightenment, that it's at the end of the path, does bring kind of utter clarity, does bring contact with profound truth, even ultimate truth, then it's reasonable to think that maybe the incremental steps that we make along the way are at least bringing us clearer vision and closer to the truth. So there is that kind of significance, that kind of practical significance to the question of kind of what this enlightenment thing is and whether it really corresponds to deep truth. Now, there are obviously some challenges in trying to kind of get a grip on enlightenment. For starters, figuring out exactly what it is, what would the experience of enlightenment be like? Because after all, as we've seen, one of the characteristics of mystical forms of enlightenment is that they are very hard to articulate as a rule. People have the sense that they have perceived the truth, but it's not so easy to describe that truth. So once we find these people who have had the experience of enlightenment, they may not be able to communicate it clearly to us. The other problem is finding these people who have had the experience of enlightenment, because after all, it's not like there's some, Buddhist agency that issues certificates to people who have attained enlightenment, so these people can just flash their credentials and we'll say, oh, you're enlightened, can you talk about it? Who's to say who's enlightened, But I do think we can at least start to flesh out the experience of enlightenment by talking to people who are clearly very serious meditators, have done a whole lot of it, seem to have had some deep experiences, and in particular experiences that do correspond to kind of core Buddhist ideas and concepts, okay? We've obviously done some of that, but we're going to do a little more of it today during the kind of the first half of the lecture. And we're going to focus in particular on two things that we haven't really looked at yet. First, we're going to look at an aspect of the idea of not-self and the meditative experience of not-self that we actually haven't covered yet. Then we're going to look at a concept known as emptiness that we also haven't looked at. Then I think we'll be prepared to address some questions that I raised at the beginning of the course, even beyond the question of whether Buddhism presents kind of a clear picture of reality. I also raised two other questions. I asked, does the Buddhist path get people closer, not just a clear view of things, of their mind, of the world out there, but does it bring them closer to moral truth? And I also asked, does this thing I'm calling naturalistic Buddhism, does it maybe qualify as a kind of spiritual or even religious worldview? I want to get back to these questions, and I think it'll help to set the stage for that assessment by fleshing out this idea of enlightenment in this particular way. So in this segment of this lecture, we're going to talk about this other side of not-self that we haven't talked about. Then in the next segment, we're going to talk about the idea of emptiness, and then we're going to try to bring it all together. So far, the aspect of kind of the not-self idea and experience we've talked about is what you might call the interior version. Okay, in other words, we've talked about kind of looking inside your mind, viewing ideas and feelings more objectively maybe than people normally do, and kind of not identifying with them. We've seen that's part of the not-self experience, is seeing that you don't have to own all of these things, you don't have to see them as part of you. But there's another kind of half of the not-self experience that I would call the exterior part of the experience. And that involves kind of getting the sense that the bounds of your body are more kind of permeable and porous than you might have thought. The boundaries are not so solid. And there's more kind of interaction with the world out there in a sense, more fluid interaction than you might have appreciated. And before we talk about the actual experience of that exterior version of not-self, I want to set the stage by shedding a little light on kind of the logic behind the experience of not-self. And I want to do that by hearing just a little bit of a conversation I had with Sharon Salzberg, who's a very well-known meditation teacher and author, and she co-founded, along with Joseph Goldstein, whom we've already met, the Insight Meditation Society, and also along with Jack Kornfield. And here's something that Sharon said to me in the course of a conversation about this.
All those times, many, many times, sometimes many times a day, we think, I should be able to control this. Because there's a sense of control that we think we're entitled to as a separate self. And so it's more an understanding, I think, that we live in an interconnected universe, that of course I'm distinct from you, and it's not that we kind of morph together in some soup, but that the truth all along has been that we live in an interconnected universe. Like sometimes in sitting in a room with people, although we could do it now in some way, I ask people to reflect who all has had some effect on the fact that you're sitting here right now. Somebody gave you a book. Somebody read you a poem. Somebody told you about this experience. You know, and people just bring to mind this, it's really like this moment is this confluence of connections and relationships and interactions. And
okay, so that helps set the intellectual context of this experience of the exterior side of not self, and it points to a part of the Buddhist argument for not self that we haven't really talked about. And that has to do with what you might call kind of the pervasiveness of causal influences on our behavior. We normally think of ourselves as kind of acting on the world, but the point here, the point that Sharon's making, is that actually the world acts on us a whole lot. And that helps explain a lot of what we do. A lot of our behavior and our thoughts are the consequence of things that have impinged on us, right? And when you think about it that way, if you think about our behavior as kind of output in response to all this input, then it's kind of, there's kind of less room for a kind of autonomous self that's actually generating and initiating a lot of behavior and thought, okay? And this is a sense in which Buddhism is very modern in having the same emphasis on kind of causal influences that modern behavioral science has, okay? Now, what is the experience of this like in meditation? Well, I've actually had a little glimmer of it a couple of times while on meditation retreats, and I remember the first time this happened. It was days into the retreat, and I was sitting there, and I felt, you know, like a tingling in my foot, and I heard a bird singing, and suddenly it just wasn't so clear to me what the difference between those two was. I don't mean I couldn't distinguish between them. You know, one was a tingling in my foot, one was a bird. But what I mean is, it just seemed to me that the tingling in my foot was no more a part of myself than the bird that was singing. I mean, after all, both of them were kind of sending signals up to here, and that was influencing the way I thought and I felt. It might be a good feeling, might be a bad feeling, but in both cases, I'm like getting a signal from somewhere. And at that moment, I mean, obviously one of the signals is originating from inside my body, but at that moment, that seemed like kind of an arbitrary separation. It didn't seem like there was really a fundamental difference, kind of structurally, between what the two things were doing with my mind. And that's kind of about as far as I've gotten. I haven't had this kind of full-on experience of what I'd call the exterior part of not self. But when I have shared this experience with kind of more serious meditators who have had more profound experiences, I have found that this does resonate. They do recognize this as kind of a milestone on the path to the kind of experience they've had. And one example is Joseph Goldstein, whom we've already heard from. And this came up in a conversation I had with him.
You know, so the boundaries can really dissolve. The experience at those times, the boundaries are very dissolved, but it's not in a, it can be in a very peaceful way. You know.
And can that entail, like, say, hearing a bird song or something, and thinking, well, that's no less a part of me than the signals I'm getting from what is within what is normally called my body.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, in that quality of openness and the sound arises of a bird, for example, there are times in meditation where we don't know, we don't make the distinction of inside and outside. It's just a sound being known. Yeah, and so that boundary very much can dissolve at times. But also people don't need to be afraid that somehow they're not going to be able to navigate in the world, because as soon as we get up from the sitting, we come back to kind of our ordinary perception. And
right.
So there's no problem in this, and it's actually quite freeing.
Now, Joseph's right. You can certainly, get up, I'm sure, from the cushion after one of these experiences and have no trouble dealing with the world. On the other hand, I do think there are some people who carry more of the experience with them after they get up from the meditation cushion than others. And a good example of that is somebody named Gary Weber. He has a very kind of interesting story. You may remember the study we talked about that showed that the default mode network gets quiet when very adept meditators meditate. Well, Gary participated in that study. He was recruited to participate because he has done a whole lot of meditating. But when he kind of went in for the brain scan and they said, okay, meditate, the default mode network seemed not as quiet as you might expect for somebody who's that serious a meditator. And finally he said, well, let me just try it without meditating. And then they found that his mind seemed very, very quiet. Okay, and this is consistent with his own account of his meditative history. What he says is, for decades, he meditated, did contemplative practice of various kinds for hours a day, and then finally passed through a kind of threshold after which he just doesn't have many of the kind of self-referential thoughts that most of us have, exactly the kind of thoughts that, for example, would show up via the default mode network. You know, what am I going to do today? What does that person think of me? Just a whole category, major category of thoughts that he doesn't, by and large, experience. And he chronicled this in a book called Happiness Beyond Thought. And I want to share with you just a little bit of the conversation I had with him that relates to this kind of exterior version of the not-self experience.
There's a line in the introduction to your book related to this. It says basically something like, the bad news is that you don't exist. The good news is that you're everything. What does that part mean?
Well, it's kind of a logical consequence. I mean, if you're nothing, if you disappear, you can then be everything. But you can't be everything unless you are nothing. It just logically follows that's the case. The everything case isn't as obvious. But if you are nothing, instead of just disappearing and becoming a void, you find out that in some strange way, and you actually see this, you perceive it this way, that everything is all one thing. This is a cliche, mystical statement, but it really is perceptible. I mean, you can deeply sense that everything is all one thing, and it's somehow, strangely, it's inside of you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I have had a meditative experience where the bounds of myself, in a certain sense, suddenly seemed a lot more permeable.
Absolutely.
That is like the place where the bird's song enters my body, my sensory apparatus no longer seemed like such a fine dividing point, you know, and things like that.
Exactly.
But that's but I don't, you know, that was like a one-time brief experience, not sure what to make of it. You're saying that as you walk around every day, or are you saying that you in a way identify with everyone else as much as you identify with yourself?
Yeah, I would say that it's a little different from that, but that's not far different. I don't identify with anything. I mean, there's just nobody here to identify with either me or with anybody else. It's just an empty, still presence here, which is there.
So the problem with saying you identify with everyone is the very beginning of the sentence, you.
Exactly. There's no you there to do the identifying.
Now, when Gary says, if you're nothing, then you're everything, basically, that may sound kind of cryptic, but I think I have an inkling of what he means. Because in that experience that I had, that I just recounted for you, I remember that, you know, one reason it was kind of easier to think of the bird song as much a part of me as the tingling in my foot is that I wasn't thinking of the tingling in my foot as very much a part of me to begin with, right? Because I'd been meditating a lot and I had this kind of more objective view of my feelings, and I was identifying with them less. So tingling in my foot, bird song, they all seemed like, well, not all that much a part of me. So in other words, it was through kind of disaggregating the self internally that it became easier to kind of see things outside the body as much a part of you as the things that were now disaggregated. Now, one interesting thing, really important thing about this exterior version of the not-self experience is that it has moral implications. And here I want you to listen to what Gary Weber has to say.
If everything is one thing and we're all in this together, not all of us, but if everything is one thing, then why should I do something if there wasn't either to do it to perturb this? Why would I do something bad to you?
Okay, now I want to emphasize that what Gary's talking about is not feeling waves of empathy for his fellow human beings. In fact, I wouldn't call Gary especially warm and fuzzy as a person. Now there is that part of Buddhism that specifically cultivates empathy and compassion. There is something called loving kindness meditation, and in fact Sharon Salzberg is kind of a leading promulgator of that. But what Gary's talking about is different. It's just the perception that since there is no separation between you and the world out there, there's just a feeling that any logic there might have been to harming anything in the world out there no longer applies. And I got very much the same sense from talking to Judson Brewer. As you may recall, he's the one who conducted the default mode network experiment. And what I may not have told you is that he is himself a very serious meditator. And he's had, I think, some pretty deep experiences. And here's an exchange I had with him.
If everyone meditated intensively, would there be any wars?
I guess I would ask that as a question. Why would someone want to harm themselves?
Mm.
So in that sense, I don't think that there would be, because it's kind of like, why would you cut off your right hand? It's kind of useful.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if people really saw the non-separation, how could they?
Okay, so that's what I would call the exterior part of the not-self experience. It is a kind of a logical extension in a way of the interior part, but it does really accentuate an important moral implication of the not-self experience that might not be so clear otherwise. And that is just that it gives people the feeling that not harming things, at least it can give people this feeling, I can't vouch for everybody, can give people the feeling that not harming things is just the logical thing to do. So this is, you might almost say that it's an example of, selflessness in the kind of literal sense of not self, just not feeling the self, not experiencing the self, leads to a kind of selflessness in a more moral sense. Okay. Now, in the next segment, I'm going to talk about this experience that is known as emptiness. And then for the rest of the lecture, I'm going to try to tie these two things together with some other things and see where we wind up.